For years, one of the most common pieces of cybersecurity advice has been quite simple. Turn on multi-factor authentication, and that was good advice. But MFA has changed, and attackers have changed. And now Microsoft is changing the way MFA works in Entra, whatever, in a pretty significant way. Starting September 1st, Microsoft is going to begin pushing users who rely solely on SMS or voice authentication towards passkeys. And beginning in February of next year, Microsoft provided SMS and voice authentication is going away completely. Now, that might sound like a product change, but I think it's actually something bigger. We're entering a world where simply saying we have MFA is not enough. The question now becomes, what kind of MFA do you have? So I wanted to dive into this topic just a little deeper, which we're going to do right now. Multi-factor authentication dramatically improved security because stealing a password was no longer enough. An attacker could phish your username and password, but they still needed that second factor. So, as always, the attackers adapted. They started stealing session tokens. They built adversary-in-the-middle phishing kits. They started MFA fatigue attacks. They socially engineered users into approving prompts. They convinced help desks to actually reset MFA. And suddenly, organizations discovered something quite uncomfortable. MFA can be present, and the authentication process can still be compromised. And that's because not all MFA methods provide the same level of protection. A text message is technically a second factor. A push notification is technically a second factor, but neither is inherently phishing resistant, and that's the distinction Microsoft is now forcing organizations to confront. And that is why Microsoft is moving towards passkeys. Starting next week, or September 1st if you're watching this later, users enabled for SMS or voice authentication will automatically be enabled for passkeys in Microsoft's authentication methods policy. When those users sign in and complete MFA, Microsoft can begin prompting them to register a passkey. But then comes the bigger deadline. On February of next year, Microsoft will retire its own SMS and voice delivery for authentication completely. If an organization still needs SMS or voice, Microsoft is saying it will need to use a customer-managed telecom provider. But Microsoft's direction here is very clear. Move users to phishing-resistant authentication. Passkeys, Windows Hello for Business, FIDO2 security keys, certificate-based authentication where appropriate. This isn't Microsoft saying MFA has failed. This is Microsoft saying the bar has moved. Now, SMS MFA was massively better than passwords alone, so let's give it credit for that. But it has weaknesses. Phone numbers can be socially engineered. SIM swapping still happens. Messages can be intercepted, and most importantly, SMS doesn't protect users from sophisticated phishing workflows that proxy authentication in real time. The same problem exists in many one-time password methods. If I can convince you to type your 6-digit code into my phishing site, I can relay it to the legitimate application. You have successfully used MFA, and I successfully stole your session. And that's a problem phishing-resistant authentication is designed to solve. The authentication itself becomes cryptographically bound to the legitimate service. There's nothing useful for the user to hand to the attacker, and that is a very different security model. And this is why I think we have MFA needs to disappear from security reporting, and where I think CISOs and security leaders need to change the conversation. See, we've spent years reporting things like 98% of our employees are protected by MFA, and that sounds great. But it doesn't actually tell me enough anymore. I want to know how many users are protected by phishing-resistant MFA, how many privileged accounts, how many administrators, how many executives are protected, how many identities can still fall back to SMS. How many accounts can enroll a new factor without strong verification? These are much more meaningful questions because two organizations can both report 100% MFA coverage and have dramatically different levels of identity risk. One might use SMS everywhere. One might use passkeys and device-bound credentials. Those aren't equivalent security postures, not even close. Now, nobody has to migrate an entire enterprise tomorrow morning, and trying to do that would probably be a great way to make everyone hate both passkeys and the security team. So start with risk. Your administrator should be at the front line of this transition, and then roles like global administrators, privileged identity administrators, security admins, cloud admins, anyone with broad access to sensitive systems. Then look at executives and high-risk users, and then expand from there. And this is where authentication strengths and conditional access become extremely useful. Instead of simply saying require MFA, you can say, for this application, this action, or this population, phishing-resistant MFA is required. And that's a much different conversation. Now, here's where organizations can accidentally undo all of this. You deploy phishing-resistant authentication. You've got passkeys everywhere, FIDO2 keys, Windows Hello. I mean, everything looks fantastic. And then someone calls the help desk and says, I lost my phone. And your recovery process is, well, what's your user ID? Congratulations. You've just built a $100,000 front door and left the screen door open in the basement. See, authentication is only as strong as the enrollment and recovery process around it. Organizations really need to think about, how is a new authentication method registered? How is identity verified before resetting MFA? Who can issue a temporary access path? How long does that pass work? Can it be reused? I mean, Microsoft itself recommends tightly controlling temporary access path because it can become a powerful backdoor if compromised. The future of MFA isn't just better authentication, it's better lifecycle security around authentication. Now, there's another piece of this conversation that's easy to miss. Not every identity can use a passkey. I mean, applications don't tap a fingerprint reader. Service accounts don't pull out a YubiKey. Automation doesn't approve authenticator prompts. So, as organizations strengthen human authentication, non-human identity becomes even more important. Managed identities, workload identities, certificates, short-lived credentials, secret rotation, ownership, least privileged. Microsoft's own phishing-resistant MFA strategy includes moving automation away from user-style service accounts toward workload identities where possible. And that matters because the more difficult we make it to compromise humans, the more attractive unmanaged machine identities become to the attackers. And attackers always move towards the easiest path. Now, we all have to remember that this is a security program change, not an MFA setting. And that's probably my biggest takeaway here. Don't treat this as Microsoft changed an Entra, whatever setting. Someone in IT will handle it. This touches application compatibility, privileged access, non-human identities, and the user experience. You're changing one of the most fundamental interactions employees have with technology, how they prove who they are. And that deserves adequate planning. So if you're responsible for security or identity, here's where I'd start. First, you have to understand how many of your users still depend on SMS and voice authentication. You can't fix a problem if you don't know how big it is. Secondly, identify which privileged and high-risk accounts are not using phishing-resistant methods. Third, make sure your authentication methods policy reflects where you want your organization to go. Yes, documentation matters. Fourth, start testing Passkeys in Windows Hello with controlled groups now, before Microsoft starts forcing it right around the corner. Fifth, review your registration and recovery workflows. And finally, don't forget service accounts and workload identities, because this isn't about checking another MFA box. It's about reducing the number of ways an attacker can steal authentication. And here's my final thoughts. MFA isn't dead, it's evolving. Now, passwords plus text messages were a massive improvement over passwords alone, but attackers learned how to beat that model, and the industry is now having to move again. We're going from something you know plus something you have towards cryptographic proof that you are who you say you are on the legitimate service you're trying to access. And that's a much stronger foundation. So when Microsoft retires SMS and voice authentication next year, I don't think the lesson is, well, Microsoft is making MFA harder. I think the actual lesson is MFA has reached the point where having it isn't enough. Now we have to care whether it's actually resistant to the current modern attacks that are being used against us. And moving forward, that's what good identity security is going to look like.